The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Hatred's peace. When Muhammad died in A.D. 632, poisoned in revenge by the widow of a man he had murdered, much of Arabia, having been forced into this new faith by the sword, tried to defect, thinking they could abandon Islam. The prophet responsible for their subjugation was dead, and with his passing had died any loyalty they had been forced to profess to this oppressive religion. They had either forgotten or no longer feared the decree Muhammad had passed on from Allah. Quote, "Whoever relinquishes his faith, kill him." End quote. During the next 2 years, A.D. 632 to 34, in obedience to Allah's command to behead apostates, Muhammad's successor and father-in-law, Abu Bakr, and loyal Muslim warriors killed about 70,000 former Muslims. Obedient to Muhammad's command and example, Abu Bakr sent forth his troops, quote, "Command them, apostates, to re-embrace Islam, but if they refuse, do not spare any one of them. Burn them with fire and kill them with force, and take the women as prisoners." End quote. These were all Arabs killed by Arabs, former Muslims killed by Muslims, and their slaughter has come down in history as the Wars of Apostasy. Thus, Arabia was forced back into Islam and remains its bulwark today. Muhammad's decree that apostates must be killed is still foundational to Islam. And even if one was never a Muslim, the Quran declares that pagans, the label attached to all non-Muslims except Christians and Jews who are people of the book, who refuse the opportunity offered them to submit to Islam, must be killed. Though certainly not adhered to in most cases of terrorism, nor in Islam's long violent history, the offer of conversion or death is required whenever possible, even in the West. The Armenius family, father, mother, and 2 young daughters, were stabbed and their throats slit in mid-January 2005 in their home in New Jersey. The father, a Coptic Christian immigrant from Egypt, had debated with Muslims on a Middle East internet chat room and had not backed down from their threats. Quote, "You'd better stop this or we're going to track you down and kill you." End quote. Yes, it can happen even here in the United States. Doubt has been cast upon whether this was a Muslim revenge killing, but that all 4 throats were slit in the same manner is hard to ignore. The police refuse to see any religious motive in the murders, in spite of the repeated threats from Muslims and the fact that Jersey City has a history of Islamic violence against American citizens. As in this instance, so in many similar cases across the country. The authorities have seemed to be more concerned that they avoid offending Muslims than in finding the murderers. A deliberate cover-up. The 1990 murder of Israeli Knesset member Rabbi Meir Kahane in Manhattan by Egyptian terrorist El Sayed A. Nosser was at first attributed by police to a prescription drug that Nosser was taking for depression. Although Nosser shot Kahane in the head, he was acquitted of murder and was found guilty only of illegal possession of a firearm. The 2002 deliberate crash of a small plane into a Tampa high-rise by a bin Laden sympathizer was blamed on the acne drug Accutane. In the 2003 murder and near beheading of an Israeli by a Saudi Arabian, Houston police were unable to find any evidence of a religious motive. Similarly, the 1990 deliberate crash of Egypt Air Flight 990, killing 217 by a co-pilot who wrenched the controls and dove it into the ocean while praising Allah, was left unexplained by the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board. Canadian police refused to rate as a hate crime the murder of a Hasidic Jew by a cursing skinhead outside a kosher pizzeria in Toronto. Twin Towers included, the popular delusion must not be disturbed that Islam is peace. Sergei Trifkovich reminds us of the complicity of Western governments in Islam's evil for the sake of avoiding offense. American citizens can be detained indefinitely in Saudi Arabia at the pleasure of their Saudi Muslim father who kidnapped them from their American mother. As an example, this happened to Patricia Rausch, whose daughters Aliyah and Aisha are now clad from head to toe in the black abaya. The Western world, oblivious to the seriousness of the challenge it faces, must awaken. To allow Muslim freedoms in the West that are denied to Westerners and even to their own citizens in Muslim nations is to encourage Islam in its goal of world domination. Avoiding offending the Muslim world at all cost is not the road to peace, but to eventual subjugation. Former PLO terrorist Walid Shobat, whose life was transformed by faith in Jesus Christ and who is now dedicated to exposing the truth about Islam, describes what he once was when he frankly declares, "These monsters act against every notion held dear by civilized societies. They recognize no ethics or moral code outside their own twisted social structure. They are a threat to the entire world, and the world should end this epidemic of barbarism. Instead, most of the world cowers." Within Saudi Arabia, the practice of any religion besides Islam is as strictly prohibited now as it was in Muhammad's lifetime. While the Saudis continue to build mosques all over the world, thousands of Christians among the hundreds of thousands of foreign workers in Saudi Arabia from India, Europe, America, and the Philippines must worship in secret, if at all. They are arrested, lashed, or deported for public display of their beliefs. Yet, the policy of suppressing truth continues. For example, in July 1977, an Englishman with a miniature camera was able to take photographs that shocked the world. The public execution in Jeddah of Princess Michelle bint Fahd bin Mohammed and her boyfriend Khalid Muhalla. She was shot 6 times in the head. He was beheaded. The photographs became part of Anthony Thomas's TV documentary, Death of a Princess. This news threw the Saudis into a fit of rage, and Western governments hurried to suppress the showing of the film. In 1980, the Carter administration strenuously opposed the program being shown on PBS. Truth is only a threat to those who attempt to hide behind lies. The truth is a threat to Islam. It is irrational and unconscionable, yet Western religious and political leaders assist Muslims in their deceit and cover-up. And to what end? Surely closing our eyes and burying our heads in the sand of denial will not bring peace with an enemy for whom lies are a major weapon. Beheadings, a Muslim way of life and death. As it was in the beginning, so it is now. No retreat is allowed from Islam. It remains Islamic law that any Muslim who turns to any other religion must be killed, preferably by beheading. That penalty is still meted out unashamedly in public executions, or privately by one's family, where the primary responsibility lies. In Saudi Arabia, the executions take place before huge crowds in Riyadh's infamous Chop Chop Square. Yet the Western world turns a blind eye. For the Taliban, it was the new sport in unused soccer stadiums, which even the unwilling were forced to witness and to hide their disapproval for fear of their own lives. The Taliban were not fanatics but true Muslims who attempted, like Muhammad, to force Islam on the unwilling. Flogging. The record is 4,000 lashes administered publicly in Saudi Arabia to an Egyptian, and amputation of limbs are used extensively as judicial punishments. Prisoners often receive no warning that they are about to be executed. They are taken to a public square, blindfolded, forced to kneel, and beheaded before the cheering onlookers. This penalty was meted out recently to a father and son who had become followers of Christ. The number of beheadings in Saudi Arabia tripled from 59 in 1994 to 191 in 1995. Beheadings declined to between 50 and 100 in 2002 and were about the same in 2003, although the exact numbers are difficult to obtain. Saudi Arabia is the only country that officially practices beheadings for apostasy, which marks it as the most Islamic country in the world. The Western world is shocked when Muslim terrorists behead their victims, yet pays no attention to the same thing being practiced by the Saudi government. In fact, this practice is in obedience to the teachings of Islam and the example of Muhammad. Defending the practice, Tariq Al-Aghani, information supervisor at the Saudi Arabian Embassy in Washington, D.C., explained that the beheadings of 3 men early in January 2002 were not because of their homosexuality, but because they had practiced it upon young boys. I would guess there's sodomy going on daily in Saudi Arabia, but we don't have executions for it all the time, he said. Well, isn't that good to know? Islamic cultivation of hatred. By decree from Muhammad, still honored as Islamic law, as we have noted, no Jew may enter Saudi Arabia. That oppressive state has accomplished what Hitler only dreamed of, a Jew-free society, carrying on what Muhammad created 13 centuries earlier. Is this Nazism resurrected? No, this is Islam as it was long before Hitler. Remember, Muhammad decreed that all Jews in the entire world must be killed before any Muslims who have died can be resurrected, and before anyone except jihad martyrs can enter paradise. There could be no more persuasive motivation for anti-Semitism to the death. To that end, from earliest childhood, Muslims in Saudi Arabia, as in other Muslim countries, are taught to hate Jews with a passion. On October 1, 2004, Saudi Arabia's IQRA TV channel conducted man-on-the-street interviews. Here are some of the questions and answers proudly televised. They clearly reveal the effect of foundational Islamic beliefs passed down from Muhammad, and of supporting anti-Jewish propaganda that constantly bombards Muslims worldwide, especially in the Middle East, day and night. Interviewer: would you as a human being be willing to shake hands with a Jew? Respondent number 2: no, because the Jews are eternal enemies. The murderous Jews violate all agreements and are full of hatred towards me. Interviewer: would you refuse to shake hands with a Jew? Respondent 4: of course, so I wouldn't have to consider amputating my hand afterwards. Interviewer: if a child asks you, who are the Jews, what would you answer? Respondent 5: the enemies of Allah and His Prophet. Respondent 6: the Jew is the occupier of our lands. Respondent 7: the murderers of prophets, our eternal enemies, of course. And Respondent 8: if only the Muslims declared jihad, they would turn them, that is the Jews, into rotten carcasses under their feet. On January 7, 2005, Sheikh Ibrahim Madiris declared in his weekly sermon, which is broadcast over Palestinian Authority television, the Jews are Jews. Their character and custom are the corruption and destruction of this land. We keep warning you, Jews are a cancer that spreads inside the body of the Islamic and Arab nation. We want to return to the 1948, that is, pre-Israel borders. We can't forget and will never forgive Britain and all governments who assisted that state, Israel, to be established on this land, a false state. He went on to declare that America and Israel were to blame for the tsunami that killed approximately 300,000 in Southeast Asia, and that America today is the sponsor of terror on this land, that is Palestine. America is on the way to the abyss, or hell. Al Jazeera television news, popular in Muslim countries, seriously offered several theories, including the charge that the U.S. government knew of the tsunami disaster ahead of time, but deliberately warned no one, or that an atomic bomb was detonated underwater by Israel and or the United States. Saudi Arabia, model of true Islam. There is no need to question or debate the true nature of Islam. One need only look to Saudi Arabia's feudal kingdom, where daily life reveals the truth about this murderous and hate-mongering religion. This is where Islam began, where its holiest sites are, and where it is still practiced in accordance with the Quran and Muhammad's example, as recorded in the Hadith. Any Muslim may have 4 wives, beat them for disobeying his demands, and divorce them by simply repeating 3 times, "I divorce you." Ibn Saud, founder of Saudi Arabia, who had been sponsored by Britain in the creation of this new state, had between 200 and 300 wives, but in obedience to Islam, he never, so far as we know, had more than 4 at a time. No wonder the extended royal family now consists of many thousands who live like princes and princesses. Saleh al-Sayiri, a 64-year-old Saudi businessman who lives in the desert 500 miles west of Riyadh and was forced into his first marriage at age 14, has married 58 women in 50 years and has forgotten the names of most of them. He remembers 10 sons and 25 daughters. He has paid out in wedding expenses and divorce settlements more than $1.6 million. He keeps each wife in a separate villa, and sometimes even in a different town to keep the peace, and he assures each that she's his favorite. Al-Sayiri has married women from about 30 tribes. As a leader of a tribe, I can't marry just anybody, he said. His latest marriage was to a 14-year-old girl, which he calls the perfect age. There were 10,000 guests. Each divorce is documented with court-issued papers that follow a simple declaration to a wife: "You are divorced." Al-Sayiri intends to keep on marrying until the number of wives he has acquired equals the number of years he has lived, all perfectly acceptable in Islam. Only Muslims may be citizens of Saudi Arabia. There is no distinction between church and state. Religious law rules the entire country. No non-Muslim place of worship may be built. The practice of any religion except Islam is forbidden. No one would dare to carry a Bible openly on the street. Even a secret Bible study in one's home could mean prison or expulsion from the country for any foreigner. For a Muslim who had converted, it would mean death. There are none of the freedoms Western democracies hold dear: freedom of speech, of the media, of the press, of conscience, of religion, of genuine vote, and so on. This is Islam. And so it would be in America, Europe, and every other country if Muslims could fulfill Allah's command to take over the world by force. Then there would be peace everywhere, Islam's peace. This is not fanaticism, but genuine Islam, as Muhammad and his successors established and practiced it, and from which no Muslim has the authority to diverge. Do not be deceived. This would be life in every country in the world wherever Muslim fundamentalists could impose Sharia, that is, Islamic law, according to the Quran and the teachings and example of Muhammad, as they have been able to do in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, in parts of Nigeria and Indonesia, and as the Taliban did when it was in power in Afghanistan, and as it is practiced by Muslim terrorists wherever they are able. Islam cannot thrive where there is true freedom. Therefore, Muslim regimes have been adamantly opposed to the United States establishing democracy in Afghanistan and Iraq. Freedom might spread and put an end to their tyranny, and to Islam as well. The hatred of democracy is seen in the fierceness with which the terrorists attempted to prevent Iraqi citizens from voting in the first free elections in that country, and have continued their murders since. Most terrorists in Iraq are foreigners who have infiltrated it from other Muslim countries. These are Muslims killing fellow Muslims for cooperating with the hated West in establishing democracy. Yet Muslim leaders had no complaints against Saddam Hussein's murderous regime, and fellow Muslims outside of Iraq, not within, praised him. A very serious problem. Democratic elections, however, do not guarantee democracy for Iraq. They do not change Iraq into a secular country, and here we face a very serious problem for which there may be no solution if America is to give the Iraqis the promised autonomy which she must. 60% of Iraqis are Shiite Muslims. The United Iraqi Alliance, UIA, of Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, Iraq's leading Shia cleric, won 140 seats in the 275-member National Assembly, but still far short of the two-thirds majority needed to elect a president. The Kurds from the north won 75 seats, which gives them a powerful bargaining position. Thankfully, the UIA will have to cooperate with the Kurds to form a coalition and elect a president, who will then give a mandate to the prime minister. It is not clear whether other measures can be decided by a simple majority vote, in which case the UIA would have almost a free hand in running the country. Sistani, as almost every other Iraqi politician, has gone on record saying that he does not favor Sharia, but such ploys are meaningless politicking. One of the most powerful groups within the UIA is the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, or the SCIRI, an Iran-backed resistance group that was formed in Tehran, Iran, in 1982. It is now Iraq's largest and best organized political organization. They have called for Sharia law to be imposed. It would be a severe blow to discover that American blood has been shed to replace Saddam Hussein with a religious dictator who could be as bad or worse. British Army officers have reports of illegal Sharia law courts operating in mosques and claim that groups of militiamen turned politicians are attempting to enforce strict religious codes. It is a dangerous situation. A university student who was beaten for holding his girlfriend's hand in public said, "I don't want a radical system to rule Iraq like Iran. It would be a disaster. We would have ended up with different faces of the same coin, from dictatorship to religious rule." A major complaint of terrorists is America's support of oppressive dictatorships in Muslim countries. Yet they wish to establish religious regimes that would be equally, if not more, oppressive through the rule of Sharia. Of course, the latter would be in the name of Islam, and thus, in their minds, fully justified in its denial of basic freedoms and its practice of summary executions of offenders. With friends like this, It is considered honorable for a Muslim to lie to non-Muslims in order to promote or defend his faith. The Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C. has repeatedly assured the United States that its country is not funding any suspected terrorist groups. Yet in documents captured by Israeli forces, Saudi officials promise that they will continue to support Palestinian terrorism against Israel. Western intelligence has verified that the Saudi government has funded terrorist organizations such as Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, the PLO, Hamas, Hezbollah, and others. Palestinian terrorism alone was supported with more than $4 billion between 1998 and 2003. In January 2002, Prince Naif, Saudi Minister of the Interior, declared that Saudi Arabia would pay $5,333 to each member of a martyr's family. Isn't this support of terrorism? King Fahd ibn Ad al-Aziz promised to support 1,000 families of Palestinian martyrs. There was certainly no expected reduction in Palestinian terrorism against Israel as the peace process progressed. Every Saudi citizen is encouraged to help in this effort with donations to the Al-Quds Intifada Fund. Sheikh Saad al-Buraik, prominent Saudi government cleric, hosted a 2-day telethon that raised $109 million from Saudi viewers for the families of Palestinian martyrs. In a Riyadh government mosque in April 2002, al-Buraik declared, "I am against America until this life ends. She is the root of all evils and wickedness on earth. Muslim brothers in Palestine do not have any mercy, neither compassion on the Jews. Their women are yours to take. Allah made them yours. Wage jihad. Pillage them." Yet Saudi Arabia poses as our partner in the fight against terrorism. After a year-long study of more than 200 original documents published in Saudi Arabia and distributed through mosques in the United States, the human rights group Freedom House, in an 89-page report, declared that Saudi Arabia is spreading hate propaganda. The literature incites ordinary Muslims attending mosques to hate Christians and Jews and to kill any Muslim who converts to another religion. To behave in the United States as if one is on a mission behind enemy lines. In a classic case of speaking out of both sides of its mouth, Saudi Arabia, through Abdul Mohsen Al-Yas, spokesperson for the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C., declared, "Saudi Arabia condemns extremism or hateful expression among people anywhere in the world." Apparently, hating and killing Christians and Jews in the name of Allah is not viewed as extremism or hateful. In fact, it is the obligation Islam lays upon every true Muslim. Human rights? The Western world is genuinely concerned about individual freedom. Reflecting that concern on December 10, 1948, after the defeat of fascist regimes in Nazi Germany and Japan, and in the face of Arab threats to annihilate Israel, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted as UN Resolution 217. The basic freedoms it advocated, however, are religiously opposed by Islam. Yet, Saudi Arabia and other Muslim countries remain in the United Nations, professing freedoms that Muslims enjoy in the West but are denied in their own countries. 32 years later, while accusing democratic Israel of being a fascist regime, Muslims showed the world the freedoms they advocate by adopting their own declaration. The Universal Islamic Declaration of Human Rights was proudly announced at the International Conference on the Prophet Muhammad and His Message, held in London in April of 1980, and adopted by Muslim nations on September 19, 1981. Incredibly, it declares Islam gave to mankind an ideal code of human rights 14 centuries ago. Based on the Quran and the Sunnah, the teachings and example of Muhammad, it held up Sharia, that is, Islamic law, as the ideal guarantee of human freedom. True Muslims really mean this and intend to force this freedom on the rest of the world. How can a meaningful and equitable peace, or even a basic understanding, be arrived at with those who equate Sharia with freedom? Islam and the West speak different languages. Some of the words sound the same, but the meaning is obviously completely foreign. 15 of the 19 northern states of Nigeria have adopted Sharia with its Islamic human rights. Subsequently, thousands of Christians have been killed and hundreds of Christian churches destroyed. In 1983, the government of Sudan in Khartoum in the north imposed Sharia on the entire country. As a result, primarily of imposing Islam and the fact that oil and gas are found in the South, more than 2 million non-Muslims in the South have been killed and thousands tortured or sold into slavery. There is an active slave market in the Muslim world today, on which Libya's Gaddafi buys slaves for $15 each. Most of this death and oppression is an attempt to force all of Sudan into Islam, as one more step toward the goal of taking the entire world for Allah. More than 5,000 churches have been burned down in Indonesia, the largest Muslim nation in the world. About 3,000 in the last 3 years, and thousands of Christians have been killed and many forced into Islam under threat of death. Legislation enacted in 2002 called Letter of Decision number 137 allows churches in West Jakarta to be closed down at the whim of the local community, a rule designed for Muslims to exploit. This is Islamic human rights. Muslims call human rights and personal freedom, as advocated in the West, the most perilous and repugnant threat facing the world. They justify Islam as the true guardian of human rights by ignoring the oppression and terror created by enforcing Islam and pointing to the evils produced by Western freedom. America, as the leading superpower and the sole power broker in the world, is leading this onslaught against Islam under the slogans of democracy, pluralism, human rights, and market economy. The most perilous of these slogans is that of human rights, one of the cornerstones of her foreign policy. She utilizes this slogan as a pretext to interfere in other countries' affairs and deems human rights as a law that must be abided by. Personal freedom is the most repugnant aspect of these freedoms, for according to them, it means that man is free to choose the behavior he likes, such as being homosexual or fornicating or taking intoxicants. This debauchery is a moral constitution amongst the followers of this ideology. In contrast to Allah and the Quran, the God of the Bible, who calls himself the God of Israel, gave man moral freedom to act responsibly without coercion. There is no way that man could truly love, trust, and believe in God and receive the free gift of salvation he provides and offers in Christ without the freedom to reject him and the love and salvation he graciously offers to all mankind. Therefore, the God of the Bible does not force anyone to do his will. He desires willing obedience that comes from the heart, not hypocrisy that has been forced by threats to deny in visible life what one practices in secret or in the imagination. The God of the Bible, in giving man freedom of choice, does not encourage men to sin, much less is that freedom a license for evil. On the contrary, he forbids all sin in the moral law that he has written in every human conscience. He has also ordained that governments should be his ministers of righteousness, enforcing morality to keep order in the world. Yet God himself cannot force man to love in his heart what his laws require in outward behavior. He wants our hearts, but we must voluntarily give ourselves to him. When Christ is willingly acknowledged as Lord and believed on and received as Savior, that transformation takes place within, out of gratitude and love for the one who paid the full penalty for our sins and delivered us from the judgment we deserve. Jesus declared that to lust in the heart is the same as committing the sin. That condemnation applies to wealthy Muslim businessmen or members of the royal family who, when visiting the West from Saudi Arabia or other strict Muslim countries, enjoy the liquor, prostitution, and other sins that they profess to shun and condemn when at home. Christ's words equally condemn the immorality of Westerners, including those who call themselves Christians with their lips, but deny God their Creator in their behavior. Islam's vicious record. One need only look at the record of Islam to see the fruit of forced morality. There have been more revolutions, assassinations, and terrorist attacks in Muslim countries, Muslim against Muslim, than in all the rest of the world combined. During the 1940s, a young Yasser Arafat, getting his training in terrorism, was a zealous member of Amin al-Husseini's Qasimite group, which fought the rival Arab Nashashiba family, all good Muslims, in a blood feud. Even in their united effort to destroy Israel in 1947 and 1948, before it could be born, Muslims were at odds with one another. Islam's peace was unable to unite them. The Mufti wished to maintain in his own hands effective control over all forces in Palestine and their activities. The Arab League was by no means inclined to recognize the Mufti as the sole authority. As soon as the Mufti realized that, he began to act independently, appointing his own men as commanders in various areas of the country, who competed with commanders appointed by the Arab League. Syria attacked its Muslim neighbor Jordan on April 13, 1957. On June 10, 1958, at Jordan's request, 2,000 British paratroopers, non-Muslim pagans to the rescue again, landed in Amman to protect King Hussein from threats by Iraq and Egypt. In 1960, Jordan's prime minister and 10 other officials were killed by a bomb planted by Nasser's agents and intended for the king. The president of Tunisia accused Nasser, at that time considered to be the leader of the Arab world, of sending secret agents to assassinate him. In 1979, Hussein's forces killed some 2,000 PLO guerrillas and thousands of Palestinian civilians in driving the PLO into Lebanon. Ayatollah Khomeini, who took over Iran in a bloody coup, was known to have plotted the overthrow of other Muslim nations, including the Persian Gulf states. From 1948 to 1973, there were 80 revolutions in the Islamic world, 30 of them successful, including the murder of 22 heads of state. King Abdullah ibn Hussein bin Talal was assassinated in Jerusalem in 1951 by a Palestinian. His grandson, King Hussein I, who succeeded him, escaped a number of assassination attempts. Saudi Arabia's King Faisal was shot to death by his nephew. Muslims attempted to kill Egypt's Nasser, and the Muslim Brotherhood succeeded in assassinating his successor, Anwar Sadat, a deed that received Arafat's public applause. In his turn, Sadat's successor, Hosni Mubarak, commander of the Egyptian Air Force during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, has narrowly escaped a number of attempted assassinations. These are all Muslims practicing Islam's peace among themselves. In 1971, East Pakistan rebelled against West Pakistan, both Muslim states, and became Bangladesh. In 1979, a dissident group of Muslims seized the holy mosque in Mecca with the Kaaba in its center. The Saudi National Guard was unable to cope with the situation, so the Saudis turned to the pagan West for help again. Of course, only Muslims are allowed in Mecca, necessitating the disguise of the non-Muslim rescue team who were all dressed in Saudi uniforms. As usual, it was Muslim fighting and killing Muslim in the promotion of this peaceful religion, with pagans having to come to the rescue. In February 1982, Syrian President Hafez Assad sent tanks and troops into the beautiful Syrian city of Hama, leveling it to rubble and killing as many as 25,000 civilians, while at the same time criticizing alleged Israeli mistreatment of Palestinians. In 1983, Arafat was almost unseated by a rebellion against him, supported by Syrian President Assad and Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi within his own Fatah organization, which actually ran the PLO. Further examples could be multiplied, and some will be given. This is the peace Islam has produced from the beginning and intends to force upon the entire world in obedience to Allah. Spreading Islam's peace. Having re-established Islam in Arabia through the wars of apostasy, Abu Bakr and the succeeding caliphs spread it swiftly by brutal conquest. Millions were killed by the conquering jihadists. With stunning swiftness and overwhelming ferocity, Islam's insatiable sword created an unprecedented empire. More rapid than the Roman, more lasting than the Mongol, in the most amazing feat in military history, conquering country after country. From France all the way to China, they compelled the unwilling to submit to the new paganism or die. Muslims assure us that they only fight defensive wars. Really? All the way to China? That deceit is exposed by the Quran's more than 100 verses commanding Muslims to spread Islam with the sword. The following are a sample. To who fighteth in the cause of Allah, whether he is slain or gets victory, soon shall we give him a reward of great value. Surah 4:74. Then when the sacred months have passed, slay the idolaters wherever ye find them. But if they repent and establish worship of Allah, and pay the poor due that is tax, then leave their way free, in brutal, humiliating submission under Muslim rule. Surah 9:5. Fight against such of those who have been given the Scripture, that is, the Bible, as believe not in Allah nor the last day, until they pay the tribute readily, being brought low. Surah 9:29. Therefore, when ye meet the unbelievers in battle, smite at their necks. When ye have thoroughly subdued them, bind a bond firmly on them. Those who are slain in the way of Allah, He will never let their deeds be lost. Surah 47:4. Truly, Allah loves those who fight in His cause in battle array. Surah 61:4. He it is who sent His messenger with the guidance and the true religion, that He may make it overcome the religions, all of them, though the polytheist may be averse. Surah 61:9. Giving early notice of the mayhem and murder that Islam would create on this troubled earth, that is, hatred's peace, 3 of Muhammad's first 4 successors, known as the rightly guided caliphs, were assassinated by fellow Muslims. Only Abu Bakr was not. Try to imagine Christ's apostles murdering one another. Abu Bakr was succeeded as caliph by Umar Abu Hafsa. His army secured all of Arabia. Fearless in battle, Muslim warriors struck terror into their enemies. Their reckless bravery was the secret of their unparalleled success. These devout Muslims actually wanted to die. Archaeologists have uncovered inscriptions dating back to this time that say, "Please, Allah, let me die in battle." To die as a martyr in jihad is the only way a Muslim may be certain of paradise. And this is the motive that drives today's suicide bombers. Yet most Muslims are unaware that neither the ancient martyrs nor today's suicide bombers could be certain of paradise and reward. Abu Bakr, Muhammad's first successor, fought loyally in jihad. But he to whom the Prophet had personally promised paradise lamented, "I have no trust concerning Allah's schemes. Even if one of my feet is inside paradise, who can determine which deed is acceptable and which is not? You do all you can do, and the accountability is with Allah. You ask Him for acceptance." A verse in the Quran refers to those who are afraid because they are about to return to their Lord, that is, to Allah, in death or on the last day. His favorite wife, Aisha, asked Muhammad to explain this verse. "O Apostle of God, is the one who was afraid of Allah the one who commits adultery, steals, drinks wine, thus he is afraid of punishment?" Muhammad gave her an answer that explains why Abu Bakr, her father, had no assurance of getting into paradise. No, he is the one who prays, fasts, and gives alms. Thus he is afraid that Allah may not accept these things from him. In contrast, Christ promised, "He that heareth, that is, believes and acts upon my word, and believeth on him that sent me, hath everlasting life, and shall not come into condemnation, but is passed from death unto life. I am the good shepherd, that giveth his life for the sheep. And I give unto them, my sheep, eternal life, and they shall never perish." John the Apostle declared to all Christians, "These things have I written unto you that believe on the name of the Son of God, that ye may know that ye have eternal life." The Christian salvation is not dependent upon whether God would accept his good deeds, none of which are acceptable for salvation, but is assured by Christ's payment in his death and resurrection of the full penalty for the sins of the world. Hoping to earn their way into paradise, Islam's jihad warriors took Damascus in 635, Antioch in 636, Jerusalem in 638, Syria in 640, and Egypt and Persia in 641. Thousands were massacred. Entire cities were put to the sword. Among them, Benissa, Fayum, Nikiu, and Obat in Egypt, Tripoli in North Africa, and Uqaida in Armenia. Carthage was razed to the ground. This was the story of Islam's peace as it progressed and spread. Champions of peace kill one another. In 644, Umar, Abu Bakr's successor, was murdered by a Muslim and succeeded by Uthman ibn Affan. This third caliph, a son-in-law of Muhammad, Abu Bakr had been Muhammad's father-in-law, consolidated and expanded the growing Islamic empire. As already noted, he standardized the Quran, burning all rival copies over protest of those still alive who remembered different readings and verses that were missing. The protesters included Aisha, Abu Bakr's daughter, one of perhaps 15 wives the Prophet had simultaneously by special dispensation of Allah, and now his widow, forbidden as a special favor of Allah to Muhammad to remarry. Betrothed to her when she was 6 years of age, Muhammad had consummated the marriage when Aisha was only 9 and still playing with dolls. Uthman, too, was murdered by a rival Muslim faction. Prevented from being buried in a Muslim cemetery, he was, ironically, buried at night by friends in a Jewish cemetery. The fourth and last of the rightly guided caliphs was Ali ibn Abi Talib, both Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, who the Prophet had asserted was preserved from error and sin in his actions and sayings. Accused of complicity in Uthman's murder, if not one of the killers, he at least protected and joined forces with them. He never fully established his rule from Damascus. Aisha supported a rebellion against him, resulting in the Battle of the Camel, in which 12,000 Muslims were killed by other Muslims. Ali won, but his troubles only increased. Within a very few years after Muhammad's murder, more than 100,000 Muslims had been killed by fellow Muslims, either in battle or by murder. Muhammad's closest companions and staunchest disciples, some of whom he had praised as perfect Muslims and to whom he had promised paradise without martyrdom, fought each other for his wealth and power. Battles raged over who would be the next leader of the growing but fiercely divided, peaceful religion of Islam. Muhammad's chief enemy from Mecca, Abu Sufyan, had converted to Islam to keep from being beheaded. He had never, however, become a true believer, as everyone well knew. Nevertheless, mere confession with the lips to save one's life was accepted by Muhammad as sufficient to make one a Muslim. His son Muawiyah was Ali's mortal enemy in bitter rivalry for leadership. After Ali had taken the caliphate, a number of skirmishes between their forces, in which many died, led to the Battle of Siffin. Ali had hated Abu Bakr and had demanded his share of Muhammad's wealth and property, but Abu Bakr had refused. Eventually, Abu Bakr's successor, Umar, gave in to Ali's demands and went against Muhammad's command not to distribute his wealth to family members. When Ali finally succeeded Uthman to become the fourth rightly guided caliph, he found himself besieged by Muslims who resented his leadership because of his part in Uthman's murder. If he was to keep control of Islam, Ali had to deal with the growing opposition. Eventually, from his strongholds in Basra and Kufa, Iraq, Ali and his men moved against Muawiyah. Before a truce was finally called in the Battle of Siffin, tens of thousands of Muslims, according to some estimates, were slaughtered by fellow Muslims. In 661, Ali, the last of the rightly guided caliphs, was murdered during morning prayers in a mosque in Kufa, Iraq, and was buried in Najaf, Iraq. The location of Ali's mausoleum and shrine there, destroyed several times by rival Muslims, then rebuilt each time, makes Najaf the center of religious power and wealth in Iraq. Its treasures are worth an estimated $1 billion. Division between Shiites and Sunnis. Muslims who regard the murdered Ali and his sons as the rightful successors to Muhammad are known as Shiites, the majority in Iran and Iraq. The others are called Sunnis and comprise the far greater majority elsewhere. Saddam Hussein and his fellow Sunnis, though the minority in Iraq, ruled and oppressed the Shiite majority, murdering untold hundreds of thousands until his ouster by coalition forces in 2003. These two Muslim factions have long demonstrated that Islam is peace by fighting one another, as in the 8-Year War, 1980 to 1988, between Iran and Iraq, when more than 1 million combatants were killed. The Imam Ali Mosque in Najaf, the scene of fierce fighting during the Iraq War in 2004, is the holiest shrine to the world's 150 million Shiite Muslims. Brutal wars between rival Muslims were fought from the very beginning. Quraysh against Bedouin Muslims, Umayyads of Medina against the Hashemite followers of Ali, and so forth. One of Ali's sons, Hussein ibn Ali, intended to establish true Islam from Kufa in Iraq, but he and most of his family were killed by rival Muslims in 680. Mecca was besieged by troops of Yazid and Umayyad. The Kaaba, later restored, was burned to the ground, its black stone split into 3 pieces. Mecca was finally retaken in 692 by Abd al-Malik, who in 691 had built the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem to replace the Kaaba. He united Muslims once again by force, and Islam continued its conquest. The Umayyad Caliphate ruled the Muslim world from 661 to 749, when all of the Umayyads were murdered by the rival Abbasids, except for one survivor, Abd al-Rahman, who fled to Spain, where he established an independent caliphate. Thus began the Abbasid Caliphate, which lasted, in spite of intrigue, assassinations, and uprisings, until 1258. The betrayal and murder of Muslims at the hands of their fellows continues to this day. Scarcely a Muslim regime is not ruled by a dictator who seized power from other Muslims, as in Syria and Iraq. The 12-year revolution in Algeria has cost more than 100,000 lives. In Afghanistan, rival Muslim warlords still fight one another. Infidels had to intervene there, as in the Gulf. This is Allah's peace in the world of Islam. The God of the Bible alone can deliver us, but the Western world has thrown him out of its schools and public institutions and will not allow him any real voice in its politics. That is a choice that the true God allows in this life, but after death comes judgment. The bloodiest empire in history. In 712, Muslim raiders under Muhammad Qasim began the invasion of India, demolishing temples and palaces and massacring entire cities. As in Constantinople, where the streets would one day run with blood, the slaughter went on for 3 days in India's port city of Dabal. The massacres perpetrated by Muslims in India are unparalleled in history, bigger in sheer numbers than the Holocaust. Everyone has heard of the Taj Mahal, but few remember that it was built by a Muslim mogul with 20,000 slave laborers. And thus Islam spread the peace that today's Muslim terrorists dream of imposing upon the entire world. Muslim conquest, including those by one Muslim faction against another, involving multiple massacres of literally millions, continued for more than 1,300 years. The Abbasid dynasty ruled until 1258, and under them, the Islamic Empire reached its zenith of power, prosperity, and learning. Caesarea surrendered under agreement that its 2,000 knights would be spared. Once disarmed, they were massacred like the Jews of Yathrib. Antioch fell with 16,000 Christians killed and 100,000 sold into slavery. In Spain, where Islam was said to be the most humane, the garrison of Muez was slaughtered in 920. Pamplona was put to the sword in 923. Then followed Cordova, Zaragoza, and Merida. with all adult males killed and women and children enslaved. The Jews of Granada were butchered in 1066, 34 years after 6,000 Jews had been slaughtered in Fez, Morocco. In 1146, Islamic Fez was decimated by another faction of Muslims, the Almohads, who conquered much of North Africa after annihilating the Almoravids, also Muslims, with about 100,000 massacred there and another 120,000 killed in Marrakesh. Similar bloodbaths of Muslim against Muslim continued. We have been able to cite only the tip of the iceberg. Such violence is the inevitable fruit of Islam, as its 1,300-year history has repeatedly and consistently demonstrated. Not one example can be given where Islam ever brought peace anywhere to any people. The 400-year rule of the Ottoman Turks, which ended in 1917, included kidnappings of young non-Muslim boys who were forced to convert and serve for life as Turkish slave warriors. Many desperate parents mutilated their children to make them undesirable. Being Greek, Armenian, Serbian, or any other non-Muslim under Ottoman rule was to live in daily fear of murder, rape, torture, and genocide. To this day, Serbs and Bulgarians loathe Turks and Bosnian Muslims. When Sultan Murad III died, his son Muhammad had all 19 of his brothers murdered, and the 7 of his father's concubines, who were pregnant, sewn into sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus. All 300 women in Murad IV's harem met the same fate at the hands of his successor, when he, like so many other Muslim leaders, was murdered by fellow Muslims, all in the interest of establishing peace Islam's way. Slaughter of Christians. Several volumes would be required even to begin to recite the anti-Christian brutality of the Islamic conquest that unmasked the lie of today's claims that Islam is peace. However, we can cite only a few examples. The Christians of Damascus were killed or sold into slavery, and their churches burned to the ground. The Sultan Baybars had all the population decapitated when they did surrender. He sent a troop to destroy the Christian village of Kara near Damascus. The adult inhabitants were massacred and the children enslaved. When the Christians from Acre sent a deputation to ask to be allowed to bury their dead, he roughly refused, saying that if they wished for martyrs' corpses, they would find them at home. To carry out his threat, this devout Muslim marched down to the coast and slaughtered every Christian that fell into his hands. In 1400, another typical leader devoted to Islam, the infamous Tamerlane, Timur the Lame, devastated the country in and around Tiflis. In 1403, he destroyed 700 large villages and minor towns, massacring the inhabitants and razing to the ground all the Christian churches, under the pretext that the 100,000 Hindu prisoners presented a grave risk to his army. Tamerlane ordered their execution in cold blood and had victory pillars built from the severed heads. Tamerlane systematically destroyed the Christians, and as a result, the Nestorians and Jacobites of Mesopotamia have never recovered. At Sivas, 4,000 Christians were buried alive. At Tus, there were 10,000 victims. Historians estimate the number of dead at Saray to be 100,000, at Baghdad, 90,000, at Isfahan, 70,000. This is hardly a tiny fraction of the slaughter. As horrible as it was, the persecution of Jews in Roman Catholic Europe was mild compared with what Ottoman Christians and Jews endured for 4 centuries. The slaughter included more than 1 million Armenians in the last decades of the 19th and first of the 20th centuries, as well as many thousands of Jews, Greeks, Syrians, Lebanese, and others. Tragically, the oppression and bloodshed were often condoned and even encouraged by Western powers, particularly England and at times America. In the great 1915 massacre, Turkish women were given the dagger to give the final stab to dying Armenians in order to gain credit with Allah for having killed a Christian. The destruction of Christian Smyrna, leaving nothing but the Turkish Muslim suburb in September of 1922 with Mustafa Kemal's Ataturk's deliberate massacre of some 200,000 Armenian and Greek inhabitants, becomes even more despicable when we realize that English, American, Italian, and French battleships anchored in the harbor repelled fleeing victims who swam out to them for help. As with today's appeasement of Islam, the Western powers didn't want to offend Turkey. In his must-read book, The Blight of Asia, George Horton, U.S. consul in that doomed city and eyewitness to the unspeakable cruelty of Islam and of Western complicity, writes, "One of the keenest impressions which I brought away with me from Smyrna was a feeling of shame that I belonged to the human race." In its foreword, James W. Gerard, former U.S. ambassador to Germany, describes Horton's book as the whole story of the savage extermination of Christian civilization by Muslims throughout the length and breadth of the old Byzantine Empire. Horton himself writes, "This process of extermination was carried on over a considerable period of time, with fixed purpose, with system, and with painstaking minute details. And it was accomplished with unspeakable cruelties, causing the destruction of a greater number of human beings than have suffered in any similar persecution since the coming of Christ. Yet Islam continues to masquerade as a divine religion with peaceful intentions, and Western political and religious leaders, educators, and media help to promote this deception to their own eventual destruction." A new kind of threat. To our shame, this horror of Islamic brutality and intended world conquest to which the West has deliberately closed its eyes is being swept under the carpet of political and religious appeasement. Those few who know the truth and the imminent danger speak of it urgently and with passion. To their deep sorrow and frustration, they find it almost impossible to awaken Westerners to the historic facts and to the unchanging and present threat of Islam. It has invaded the West in seemingly benign form, professing peace for all. Most perplexing is the persistent claim of President Bush and other Western political and religious leaders that Islam is peace. If Western leaders continue to deny the awful truth and fail to take appropriate steps, the West will be overcome. Confident that Nazi crimes, too, would soon slip from the world's memory, Hitler reportedly told his generals, "Go, kill without mercy." Who today remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? As the Western world refuses to acknowledge the victims of Islamic slaughter through the centuries and either denies the Holocaust or is fed up with being reminded of it, so it continues to pretend that Islam is peace amid the ongoing butchery of our day. The imams boldly preach jihad in the mosques, while the followers of Islam are determined to conquer under cover of the popular lie that Islam is as peaceful as any other religion, as though Baptists or Presbyterians might just as well be behind the spreading worldwide terrorism as Muslims. Late in 2002, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Anifi, Imam of the Mosque of King Fahd Defense Academy in Saudi Arabia, declared, "We will control the land of the Vatican. We will control Rome and introduce Islam in it. Yes, the Christians will pay us jizya, that is, poll tax paid by non-Muslims as dhimmis under Muslim rule, in humiliation, or they will convert to Islam." This time the invasion is not with armies, but with immigrants. As avowed Muslims, building their mosques and keeping themselves aloof from neighbors through Arabic Islamic customs and religion that date back to the days of Muhammad, this new breed of Islamic invaders knows that Islam must inevitably conquer the world. If they fail in this quest, Muhammad was a false prophet and Allah a false deity, which no Muslim can admit without being marked for the death penalty prescribed for apostasy. This new invasion army will use democratic processes to gain control in communities where immigration creates Muslim majorities. And when they are strong enough, inevitably, Sharia must follow. The very human rights that are denied in Muslim countries are being used to destroy the Western world that grants them. Examples such as the following news report, dated January 25, 2005, could be multiplied by thousands throughout the non-Islamic world. Sheikh Omar Bakri Muhammad, a 46-year-old Syrian-born cleric granted political asylum years ago by Britain, has urged young Muslim men all over the world to support the Iraq insurgency on the front line of the global jihad, investigators say. He struck a similarly defiant tone this month at a rally attended by 500 people at a central London meeting hall, where a giant screen behind him showed images of the World Trade Center falling. "Allahu Akbar, Allah is the greatest," some audience members shouted at the images. After eavesdropping for months on his nightly praise of the September 11th hijackers and of suicide bombings, Scotland Yard said last week that it was investigating Sheikh Omar, the leader of Al Muhajirun, which, interestingly, is Arabic for the immigrants, Britain's largest Muslim group, and officials are exploring whether they can deport him. On Sunday, January 23, 2005, the German police arrested a man suspected of being a member of Al-Qaeda and charged him with recruiting men to carry out suicide bombings in Iraq. These arrests were part of an ongoing investigation in cooperation with the United States of recruitment and other terrorist activities in Europe. Italian investigators say several recruits from Italy carried out bombing attacks in Baghdad. Swiss officials say they are concerned that several militant clerics have openly urged men to become terrorists. Bor Eddin Benhavia, the 33-year-old imam recently deported by France to Algeria, had urged young men in a working-class neighborhood of Lorient outside Nice to join jihad, French officials have said. In raids in several German cities on January 12th, the German police arrested 22 people suspected of being militant Muslims, while recovering dozens of forged passports and boxes of militant propaganda. British officials say that if they want to deport an imam who they fear is inciting violence, the proceedings can often take months or even years. In Britain, where 1.8 million Muslims live, elected officials are demanding that the police move quickly against several imams, who they say have become far more vocal in recent weeks. Sheikh Omar, who has lived here since 1985, warned that Britain must scale back its anti-terrorism laws or it would face a horrendous response from angry Muslims. In the months after September 11th, diplomatic pressure built for Britain to move against outspoken imams. But it was not until last May that British officials arrested the most high-profile militant cleric, Abu Hamza al-Masri of the Finsbury Park Mosque in North London. He was charged with soliciting or encouraging others to murder people who did not believe in the Islamic faith. Mr. Masri also faces extradition to the United States, where he is charged with 11 terrorist counts, including trying to establish a terrorist training camp in Oregon. Now leading the Finsbury Mosque, Imam Abu Abdullah said in an interview, "People see us as extremists because we don't compromise the religion of Allah." This is the religion of Allah. So terrorists are not extremists after all, but real Muslims, exactly what we are documenting to be true. Muslims in England threaten an angry response if Britain doesn't soften its attitude toward terrorism, and they become angriest of all if we reject the slogan, "Islam is peace." Yet how many Westerners are willing to face the truth? Sheikh Omar Bakri justifies violence and murder against all Americans. Those who voted for them are equally guilty with the leaders they elected because after World War II, America effectively declared war on Muslims and Islam by giving military, financial, and diplomatic support to the Israelis. He justifies 9/11 because Americans had no covenant of security with the Muslims. Only qualified scholars in fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, could have planned this because the 19 used non-Muslim aliases to enter the country, which legally allowed them, by Islamic law, to act in jihad. After al-Qaeda admitted responsibility, it was obvious that qualified ulema, Islamic scholars, were behind it. Thus, al-Qaeda has revived the culture of terrorism in Islam after 200 years. In terms of Islamic jurisprudence, only Muslims are innocent. All non-Muslims are rebel criminals against Allah. Muslims who engage in interfaith dialogue are apostate, subject to the death penalty. Muslims did not attack the USA. 9/11 was an act of retaliation to force America out of the Muslim world, even though they came there in response to Saudi Arabia's pleas for help. The brazen double standard and special meaning of common words is evident and alarming. Are any political leaders and their advisors paying attention? The West dreams on. Episcopal Bishop Bullen Dali from Sudan was stunned at the attitude he encountered in the United States. He came to Washington, D.C. in October 2001, seeking sympathy for the 2 million of his countrymen murdered by Muslims from the North, and for those who would, without appropriate Western intervention, likewise become victims. The World Trade Center had just come down, and the Pentagon had been attacked. But he could scarcely arouse any interest at poorly attended press conferences where he warned that Islam is a militant religion, in vain. He pointed out that Sudan's death toll is larger than the combined fatalities suffered in Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Somalia, and Algeria. Twice as many Sudanese have perished in the past 2 decades as in all the war-related deaths suffered by Americans in the past 200 years. But hardly anyone listened. The bishop's host could not get him a slot on NPR, on the networks, or any other high-profile venue previously so eager to accommodate any itinerant mullah praising the religion of peace and tolerance. To Bishop Dali, it may seem incomprehensible that the U.S. has intervened militarily and politically to save the Muslims in Bosnia and Kosovo from alleged genocides, perpetrated by their Christian neighbors, while it remains indifferent to the very real genocide of Christians that has been perpetrated by the ruling Muslims in Sudan for 2 decades. He does not understand that his flock's very Christianity barred them from certified victimhood in the eyes of the ruling Western elites. It is frustrating and puzzling that there is a consistent American bias in favor of the Muslim party in virtually every conflict with a Christian nation. Will the West ever gain the moral conviction to face the truth and act upon it? If not, we are willfully, and in spite of much warning, contributing to our own eventual subjugation to the horror of Islamic rule. The height of American leaders' naivete or willful blindness to the truth about Islam is seen in the appointment by New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg of Omar Mohammadi to his city's Human Rights Commission on October 15, 2002. This was little more than a year after 19 Muslims destroyed New York's Trade Center and attacked the Pentagon. Mohammadi is general counsel to the New York chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE. CARE has expressed great concern for any discrimination against Muslims in America, but has no criticism for fellow Muslims kidnapping and beheading civilians in Iraq, for the ongoing slaughter of women and children by Muslims in Sudan, Indonesia, Nigeria, or for other repeated atrocities by Muslims worldwide. CARE has had ties to terrorist groups such as Hamas, which trains suicide bombers and advocates a Muslim takeover of the United States. Yet it claims to be a grassroots civil rights and advocacy group that stands for equal rights for all, including freedom of religion. CARE's latest deception was launching a media campaign in August 2005 to convince the American public that Islam does not support violence and that terrorists are not true Muslims. The tragedy is that most Americans will continue to believe this oft-repeated lie. Will the West wake up before it's too late? British complacency was shattered the morning of July 7, 2005, when, in a coordinated terrorist attack, 4 powerful bombs strategically detonated by al-Qaeda's suicide bombers, 3 on the London Underground within 50 seconds of each other, and 1 on a double-decker bus less than an hour later, caused nearly 60 deaths and injured some 700 others. Mobile phone networks were at times unable to handle the emergency calls. Shaken, too, was the confidence at the G8 summit of leaders meeting in Gleneagle, Scotland at that time. Prime Minister Tony Blair hurried back to London. It was the deadliest attack upon Britain since a German V-2 rocket killed 131 people in Stepney on March 27, 1945, near the end of World War II. The identity of one of the 4 bombers, Mohammed Sadiq Khan, had already come to light through the laptop computer of an al-Qaeda operative arrested in August 2004 in Lahore, Pakistan. Incredibly, after briefly scrutinizing Khan, British intelligence MI5 determined that he was not a likely threat and so was not put under surveillance. That computer was said to contain plans for tube attacks in London, as well as attacks on financial buildings in New York and Washington. In a classic case of bungling that we cannot afford in this war, the American government leaked the identity of an al-Qaeda cell in Britain that was revealed on the laptop, forcing police in Britain and Canada to make premature arrests. Tom Ridge, U.S. Homeland Security Secretary, apologized, but irreparable damage has already been done. 2 weeks later, 4 more explosions occurred on the transit system, but this time it was only the noise of detonators while the bombs themselves failed to explode. All 4 of those would-be suicide bombers, murderers, were quickly rounded up, one in Rome who was being held on international terrorism charges. Yet the willingness of the British to accept Islam as a peaceful religion was apparently unshaken. Sticking to the same story mouthed by other world leaders, Blair declared, "We know that these people act in the name of Islam, but we also know that the vast majority of Muslims here and abroad are decent and law-abiding people who abhor those who do this." Any Muslim who abhors such terrorism would also have to abhor Muhammad for doing even worse, as well as the thousands of Muslim leaders who have ever since followed his example. They would likewise have to abhor the jihad teachings of the Quran and Hadith. The bomb factory was located in Leeds, and explosives were found in a number of homes that were raided in the Leeds area. Most disconcerting was the fact that the suicide bomber murderers, 3 of Pakistani, 1 of Jamaican descent, whose pictures were caught on surveillance cameras, were not foreigners who had invaded England, but homegrown, likable young men who loved football and cricket. Some 3,000 British young men of Middle Eastern descent had been trained in al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan before the American invasion. No better proof could be given of the effectiveness of the imams who in British mosques preached terrorism jihad as a vital part of Islam. Nor could the British be blamed for beginning to look askance at every dark-skinned Middle Easterner as a potential terrorist. Yet, like Blair, they were still not ready to face the truth about Islam itself. Of course, the Queen was deeply shocked that terrorists were active in the heart of peaceful, cosmopolitan London. The Union Jack hung at half-mast over Buckingham Palace. Will the Stars and Stripes soon follow? Sheikh Omar Bakri Mohammed, referred to earlier, who had repeatedly praised the 9/11 hijackers and had preached hate for years against the country that took him in as a refugee, had vowed in December 2004 that if Western governments did not change their policies, Muslims would give them a 9/11 day after day after day. Bakri suddenly left England for Lebanon, not, however, before declaring that if he had known Muslims were planning attacks such as the July 7 bombings in London, he would not have informed police. He claimed that the teaching of Islam would not allow him to betray Muslims to authorities, an explanation that must have added to Londoners' growing sense of insecurity. Home Secretary Charles Clarke issued a belated order preventing Bakri, who should have been deported years ago, from returning to England. Yet CARE dares to say that this Muslim leader, and multitudes just like him, do not represent Islam. In the meantime, Islamic terrorism, far from diminishing, only seems to be gathering momentum. This is true even inside Iraq, where coalition and Iraqi troops, themselves Muslims, have been battling for months to stamp out this religiously motivated slaughter. One of the latest incidents, for example, just before this book went to press for the second printing, was the deadliest series of single-day homicide bombings in Baghdad in weeks, although homicide attacks with far lower death tolls occur here regularly. The violence came as Iraq's leaders resumed negotiations on a draft of a new constitution. A homicide car bomber targeting policemen detonated his vehicle outside the Nada bus station in central Baghdad. A second homicide bomber exploded his vehicle near the Kindi hospital about 30 minutes later, as many of the wounded were arriving for treatment. 43 people died and 85 were wounded. Elsewhere, 6 new Iraqi soldier recruits were killed execution-style after gunmen stopped their minibus on the way to a training camp in Kirkuk. So said Fox News on August 17, 2005. But less than a month later, that record was eclipsed when coordinated attacks killed more than 190 in Baghdad. Insurgents believed to be allied to Abu Musab Zarqawi's group Al-Qaeda in Iraq kept up bombings in the capital on Thursday, September 15, 2005, launching strikes that brought the 2-day death toll here to more than 190. 3 car bombs in a western neighborhood of the capital killed 4 Iraqi postal workers and 17 police commandos, police and Interior Ministry officials said. Iraqi and U.S. leaders have identified the commandos as Iraq's front line against the insurgency. Meanwhile, 1 policeman was killed in a gun battle with insurgents, and another officer was found handcuffed and shot in the head, news agencies said. The bodies of 7 unidentified men were found in spots around the capital, blindfolded with their hands tied. A day earlier, at least 14 car bombs across Baghdad killed more than 160 people, the majority of them Shiite Muslim civilians, the war's highest toll for deaths inflicted by insurgent attacks in the capital. The merciless slaughter is driven by the belief that jihad is the highest calling of every Muslim, and that committing suicide in the process of destroying as many as possible of the perceived enemy is the surest way to the Muslim paradise promised by Muhammad. That promise fuels this deadly game. If that belief could be shown to be a delusion promoted by a false prophet, homicide bombings would come to a halt. The first step in the right direction would be for Western religious and political leaders to stop their lies about Islam being a religion of peace, and to acknowledge and publicize strongly the truth that Islam is not a peaceful religion, but, in fact, is responsible for terrorism by Muslims worldwide. Only then could terrorism be combated honestly, intelligently, and effectively. Yet the cover-up to avoid offending Muslims continues unaffected by increasing terrorism. England's Prince Charles, with his new wife Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, arrived in Washington November 1st, 2005, to persuade George W. Bush and Americans of the merits of Islam. Terrorists can apparently be assured that no matter how many more innocent people they kill and maim, the West will continue to believe that Islam is a religion of peace, being given a bad name by a few extremists. Those who know the awful truth shout it to a Western world that refuses to listen. The following terse comment from a veteran combatant against Islam's terrorists all over the world betrays seething anger, maddening frustration, yet dogged determination to eliminate this menace to civilization. Chechnya had seemed almost a vacation. We had traveled to the combat zones of Russia straight from weeks in the southern Sudanese desert. Sudan's own war was more than 20 years old, leaving a legacy of incomparable devastation, mutilated tribespeople, and women raped on a mass, institutionalized scale that made Saddam Hussein's worst efforts at torture and degradation pale in comparison. In Sudan, our 5-man team included veterans from elite military units of the United States, Russia, and Great Britain. While there, we had provided much-needed security services and participated in the redemption of more than 3,000 slaves. They had all been women and children. The adult male villagers were never taken. They were either killed on the spot in raids or dispossessed of limbs by machete-wielding assailants and left to stumble along in the desert as best they could. The women were taken as sex and labor slaves by government troops and Osama bin Laden's own constructed National Islamic Front. The willful blindness on the part of the West and the determination not to face the truth about Islam climbs to ever higher levels of naivete. So much so that Muslims need not hide their vicious agenda. The Hamas website boldly proclaims to a world that refuses to believe that the horror can be real. Quote, "We are a nation that drinks blood, and there is no blood better that is more delicious than the blood of the Jews." End quote. Yet the Western world continues to blame Israel for not making peace with such enemies. In the process, we are incurring God's growing wrath and sowing the seeds of our own destruction. Please visit our website, thebereancall.org, to access our radio archives going back to 1999 and our newsletter going back to 1986. We offer daily updates by email or visit us on Facebook or Twitter. Are you looking for information about a specific topic? Go to thebereancall.org and click on Topics at the top of the page. Our online store is thebereancall.com. We offer a wide variety of books, tracts, CDs, and DVDs. Note that most of our ebooks are free. I'm Gary Carmichael. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you can join us again next week. Until then, we encourage you to search the Scriptures 24/7.
Though none go with me, I still will follow. No turning back, no turning back.